Jason, welcome. This is episode 1 of Salmon Matter, where we examine the many aspects of the challenges salmon face and the work of the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Without a doubt, the biggest and most pressing issues right now is the rock slide at Big Bar, the impact it has had and will continue to have. So let's start by recapping what happened.
Well, the slide was discovered, or at least reported to fisheries people, in about June of this year,
Right.
late June. And there was a very quick response. It was investigated right away, and it was seen to be a problem. People were very concerned from when it was first discovered. And one of the things that was done in the initial investigation was to try to figure out when it had occurred. And by looking at, I think it was satellite photos, you could, and I've seen this series of photos, you can see from about late October of 2018, there is no evidence of the slide. There's a rapids just upstream of the slide area.
Yeah.
And then in early November of 2018, that slide area, the slide has come down and that rapids is now backwatered. So the rapids disappear. So you could see that it occurred sometime in that time period. And the significance of that is that the spring flood or freshet that would have come through this spring in 2019 was not strong enough to move those rocks in a way that eliminated that barrier, because that's what you might hope for in a good news situation. A slide would come down in the fall, but the spring freshet would move it out. So these rocks are really big, and there are a lot of them.
And that causes a significant barrier for salmon to get beyond the slide to get back to their spawning grounds.
Yeah, that's right, Stu. At the high water period, when the earlier salmon come up the Fraser River, so in late June, early July into August.
When we have that maximum spring runoff, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so there's a drop. The drop there this year was estimated to be somewhere between 5 and 6 meters at its highest. So you have a mini waterfall or plunge right in the middle of the Fraser River with all of that water. And it's a naturally narrow spot already, and the rock slide happened and made this naturally narrow spot even narrower.
So a combination of the volume of rock and the volume of water makes it almost impossible for the salmon to get past the slide.
Yes, and often in a situation like this, salmon will find a slightly slower spot around the edge or a little place where they can navigate by hiding behind some rocks and working around. But there's just too much water in too small a space for salmon to get by this year. And it was terrible. Like early in the year, virtually no salmon were getting by. And we have not seen a problem like that in the Fraser River, probably since the Hell's Gate slide in the early 1900s.
Which of course requires human intervention to clear it so that the salmon can make it through. For those who have no idea where the slide is located, where in BC is it? I ask so that viewers know where it is, because it's not just off the side of the highway the way that Hell's Gate is. This is quite remote.
Yeah, it's north of Lillooet, upstream of Lillooet. It's roughly in line with the town of Clinton. So if you're driving between Cache Creek and 100 Mile House, it's about halfway in between there to the east, where the Fraser River runs through a fairly deep and narrow canyon.
And there is the Big Bar Lake as well.
Yeah, Big Bar Lake. That's not significant to the blockage, but it's a notable landmark in the area.
Yeah, just for anybody who's trying to get a sense of where it is, that gives you a real idea where we're talking about.
Yeah.
How important is this to salmon spawning?
Well, there are several major runs of salmon in the Fraser that have to get past this point. So this blockage is upstream of the Thompson River. So luckily, all the fish that turn on their migration from the Fraser and head up the Thompson were all spared from this blockage. They don't have to migrate past here. But any salmon that go past the Thompson and past Lillooet have to get through this blockage. And so this is major salmon runs like the early Stuart population that in its peak in recent times, in the early 1990s, were over 1 million fish. And that run has declined a lot for other reasons since then. But you're talking about runs of that magnitude. There are sockeye going up to the Bowron River past Prince George, sockeye going into the Quesnel and Horsefly system, sockeye going into the Chilcotin and the Chilco River. And you're talking about runs that in their peaks, some of them can be in the millions, certainly in the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, depending on the river. And then there are also Chinook populations that are trying to get up into those areas. And some of those Chinook populations have already in recent years been experiencing really significant declines to the point where there's a major conservation concern for these fish. And all of those fish, at least those coming through early in the summer, were impacted by this rock slide and just the impossible nature of getting past there.
And of course, we want to protect those Chinook runs, especially when we think about the relationship to the southern resident whale population. They like to feed on Chinook, and if the salmon population is compromised as a result of Big Bar, then it has long-lasting impacts on the southern resident whale population.
Yeah, and certainly it's a complicated interconnection between salmon and the southern resident killer whales, but certainly some of the leading science has identified that these Chinook salmon are an important prey item, and we also, people following in the media will see there is a conservation concern for those southern resident killer whales.
Yes,
and one of the measures that is being looked at to try to help them out are ways to increase Chinook salmon numbers coming out of the Fraser to maybe counteract some of the things that are thought to be limiting their access to food. So there's a complicated series of interconnections, which is one of the reasons that this is such a major and significant issue. And to extend your point, Stu, it's not just an issue for people who care about Chinook salmon in the upper Fraser River or people who care about sockeye salmon in the upper Fraser River. It translates really to all of British Columbia, and it's a significant issue for Canada.
So we discovered the slide. There was a coordinated effort between First Nations, DFO, the province of BC, and we started to move pretty quickly. But still, I was looking at the number of fish they were able to transport by hand and helicopter and what other means they had available to them. Those numbers were low. Then add in the additional trauma of human intervention. So what was the likelihood of those fish surviving?
Well, I can give an example of one set of population numbers that we know about. The early Stuart Sockeye are one of the sockeye populations that we're trying to get through when it was at about its worst, when the water levels were the highest. And they don't know exactly how many they transported, but there's an estimate of somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 early Stuart Sockeye were put in a bucket in a helicopter, flown past the site, and then released so they could carry on their migration. So that's a small number relative to the total that would have been expected, which I think based on 4 years ago was more around 28,000 or something, but still a lot of salmon for people to move. So 1,500 to 5,000 salmon were moved, and the survey of how many made it to the spawning grounds identified 89 salmon actually made it.
That's it?
That's it, for the early Stuart population.
Out of that 1,500, only 89.
Only 89 made it. And out of a return that, at least based on 4 years ago, you would have hoped would have been at least 28,000. And, if conditions are good, would have been more than that. And 89 made it to the spawning ground. So this is a devastating result for these fish.
So that population is definitely in distress at the moment.
Absolutely.
Holy smokes.
And that's just one population, right?
Yeah.
I'm describing the early Stuart population that migrate up into the upper ends of the Stuart and Taklow watershed up past Vanderhoof and Fort St. James. And there are a number of other sockeye populations in the upper reaches of the Fraser that had similar circumstances. And there's a little bit of good news in some cases, like some of the fish that came through a little bit later seem to have got through in better numbers, and essentially as the water levels dropped, salmon were able to get through. But I'm not trying to overplay the good news. Overall, the story for salmon trying to get past this site is a terrible story, both for Chinook and for sockeye.
Yeah, it's a terrible story. And when you take a look at the site, yes, they move quickly, but still, to go in and mitigate the impact, you have to wait for water levels to start to drop. So I don't think it was until about late August or early September that they were able to create a bit of a channel that allowed larger numbers of salmon to get through. So what do we know about the number of salmon that actually did get through?
The assessment data are still being compiled, so I don't know that off the top of my head in terms of how many made it through. But the general nature of the story is Those that come earlier are naturally the ones that tend to go further up in the watershed.
Right.
And those are the ones that arrived when the water levels were at its highest. So those ones did the worst, the ones going further up the Fraser. The ones that had a shorter migration, that were maybe going up into the Chilcotin or up into the Quesnel, had a little bit easier time because water levels were dropping as summer went on. And around late August, I think they were detecting fairly ready fish passage past that site for all the fish that were stacking up. So fish that came through later maybe had a hard time, but not so much that they couldn't get through and continue their migration to the spawning grounds.
Well, human efforts were able to start to clear a little bit of a channel at that point, but you got to be careful there.
Not
don't
sure.
You?
Well, not sure how much benefit that actually had, and this is not at all to criticize the effort. As you alluded to, the effort was significant from the federal government, provincial government, First Nations, and then a number of other entities that joined in to help. And I could say, as somebody who spent a long time working for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that it was an exceptional effort and very, very high degree of coordination.
Yes.
And I was invited out to the site in the summer and saw some of the work that was going on. There were hundreds of people working very, very long hours, working very, very hard, putting their heart and soul into trying to look after these salmon, doing everything they could. But it was dangerous. The water level was high. The rock slopes were unstable, so the scalers were trying to make it safe for people to work at the bottom. And you're in a very, very deep and steep and narrow canyon, where even doing things like flying a helicopter in there is dangerous. Running a boat in there is dangerous. So the effort was monumental. Unfortunately, it was just so much of a task that it was not very much you could do with the tools and options people had at their disposal. And it really points to the most important thing to do there is to try to reduce that blockage. Right now, while water levels are naturally low, when it is possible to get out to those big rocks that have fallen off the cliff and are out in the middle, and some of the natural bedrock formations that are constricting the water flow and therefore making fish passage difficult, is right now when it's more important than ever to get out there and try to make that better so that we don't have this problem again next year. Because if it sits there like that right now, even with all of the thousands of hours and millions of dollars that were spent this year, we're unlikely to be able to move by human intervention the large numbers of fish that will be showing up again.
That, of course, begs the question, where do we go from here? What are the next steps? And what's the window of opportunity that we have?
Well, my understanding, based on information that I've gathered and people have shared with me, is that water levels typically come up in that area around March 15th. So, nature can do different things, sometimes a little sooner, sometimes a little later. But once water levels start to come up, it will get much more difficult to get out and work on the rocks, because essentially it's hard to imagine until you've been there, but the rocks are enormous. They're bigger than your studio here. Wow. And it takes, it's not something that you can just put an excavator or some kind of typical heavy machinery in there and move it around. The treatment, as best I understand it, and I'm certainly no engineer or large rock expert, is to try to break and blast those rocks to make them smaller, make passage of the water and of fish more free, and ideally break those rocks up into smaller particles that the river can move out of the way and make salmon passage occur naturally.
That's one of the things that they did at Hell's Gate, didn't they? They went in and
my understanding is that was done, and a man-made fishway, as is there today, was also built. And so treatments like that may also be necessary here. But I think the first thing to do, given the limited time, is to do everything we can to try to make that constriction not so much of a problem. Blast those rocks, break up the bedrock, and reduce that problem that came from this rockfall. And there really is very, very little time, because as we saw in the interior, I came down this morning, it snowed last night. It snowed all the way through the Coquihalla down into the valley bottoms. And you can imagine how much harder it will be to work as winter conditions come. So getting out there sooner than later and doing everything that can possibly be done to remove that constriction is what I think we should be working on.
Add in the fact we're starting to see early accumulations of snow. Well, that's moisture that's being stored and will eventually turn into massive volumes of water, making it all the more important that we act quickly. Now, of course, safety is a major concern. We don't want the people who come to remediate the problem get hurt because the work is tricky. Also, who's responsible to do this work?
Certainly, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has a responsibility for salmon, and I think the federal government through DFO is very, very active in working on that. The provincial government also have a role in terms of responsibility for land and water management, and First Nations certainly have a role in terms of their leadership around managing for salmon, other natural and cultural and spiritual resources that they manage.
I saw images of the Premier of BC out there assisting, so obviously the province cares. And it's my understanding the First Nations communities that are to be credited first for calling attention to and then responding to the slide. But moving forward, addressing this unfolding tragedy will have to be a coordinated effort, won't it?
Well, I think so. And again, I certainly appreciate and applaud the very, very significant effort that went on this summer from all of the parties that were involved, the First Nations, the federal and provincial governments. But I do remain very, very concerned that here we are into middle of November. You know, this problem has been worked on since it was discovered in June. But at this point, there has been no major intervention to try to break those rocks. There's been no blasting or any major action on site yet. And so I do know that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans are working with others on advancing those plans, but I remain concerned that at this point, action hasn't been taken, and there are really not very many weeks left before water levels will come up.
Well, it's November the 12th as we record, and I understand we're looking at about 17 odd weeks from now, and probably closer to 12 weeks from the time we air this episode. So the time to act is now.
And if you think about what it would take to mobilize the kind of equipment and expert personnel and establish appropriate safety protocols to have people out there doing this kind of unpredictable and dangerous work, there isn't a lot of time to spend, now thinking about it. We have to get out there and act. And this is not...
Because we can't run the risk of having another summer, as you pointed out,
that's
like
right.
the one we just experienced.
That is something that would be terrible for salmon, terrible for the ecology and all of the other animals and the ecosystem that depend on salmon, terrible for the people that depend on or just value salmon. And in some cases, we might be talking about something that could start to push some of these stocks on a path towards extinction that we might not recover from. And again, this is nobody's fault, right? Nobody did something to make these rocks fall in. It's something that's happened as a result of a natural event. But I think we have within our ability the opportunity to get in there and use all of our technology and know-how to do something to make this better for salmon.
The hardest thing for anybody watching this program is to ask themselves, well, what can I as an individual do? Now, maybe there's nothing that I can do, but if there is, what is it?
Well, I certainly think supporting this being an urgent and important issue is useful. I can say as a public servant, calling DFO might not be the most productive thing because then people are spending time answering the phone instead of working on the problem. But, support through your local member of parliament or MLA or mayor and council, I think would be useful. Certainly, this has to be in the hands of experts to deal with the problem. But in behind it, there is going to be a need for assisting and accelerating recovery of the stocks that were affected this summer. And if the problem isn't able to be solved this year, then the stocks that will be affected again next summer. So there is going to be a lot of work to do in the upper part of the Fraser to maybe help accelerate recovery of those stocks through things like habitat restoration, maybe enhancement programs or other things to benefit those fish. And we might have to make other adjustments to things like our normal fisheries in the future in order to help look after the few fish that are remaining and help get them back into their spawning grounds so they can rebuild those populations.
Is this another opportunity for the Pacific Salmon Foundation to play a role in habitat restoration?
Absolutely. We are looking at that kind of thing right now as the Pacific Salmon Foundation. We are starting to contemplate what some of the watershed scale restoration efforts that we could possibly assist with. We are in conversations with DFO around how we can support some of their work on some of the salmon enhancement that they're doing, and we're certainly looking to help educate and involve the public as much as possible in assisting with these recovery efforts. So we don't have any specific plans yet because we're actively working to support the works that are underway as well as see how things turn out. But it's a very, very high priority on our radar to start to put plans in place to help contribute to accelerating the recovery of these affected fish.
This is an issue that we'll need to monitor very closely and probably come back to revisit in 2020.
Well, I hope we do, Stu, because
Yeah.
we have not ever seen something like this in our lifetimes, really.
No.
And it's important for people to understand that, as you said earlier in our chat, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And I think some people heard that salmon were getting through later in the year, and they might have the impression the problem is solved. But, one of the things that I think I've tried to emphasize today is that it hasn't been solved. There is a lot of work left to do, and the consequences are really, really significant. So it's important to put all the energy we can into making this better.
Great. Thanks for coming in and sharing that with us.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks for having me.